Orchestrated fresh narrative architecture mirroring proven formula, with Canadian luthier protagonist. Orchestrated fresh narrative architecture mirroring proven formula, with Canadian luthier protagonist. The salesman started laughing before the old truck had even come to a full stop. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of bright cold Toronto morning where the light comes in low and hard off the lake and turns every chrome surface into a small sun. The truck was a faded green half-ton with a rust scab over the rear wheel well, and a passenger mirror held on with a wrap of hockey tape. It pulled into the visitor bay outside Hartley and Crane Fine Instruments, and sat there ticking while the man inside leaned across the bench seat to unbuckle a small girl who was already talking before her feet touched the pavement. Brett Hollins watched all of this through the front glass with a coffee going cold in his hand, and he said what he said loud enough that the two other salespeople near the front desk heard it and gave him the small laugh he was fishing for. He had a particular talent for that. He could measure a person by their boots and their truck and the way they hesitated at a door that cost more than the truck did. And he could land the joke before the person was even out of the cold. The man who climbed down was somewhere in his 40s, lean, with a few days of gray-flecked stubble and the kind of forearms that come from real work rather than a gym. His name was Desmond Croft, though no one in that building would learn it for another 20 minutes, and by then it would mean something very different than it meant now. His daughter was 7. She was named Quinn after no one in particular, just a sound her mother had loved, and she came around the front of the truck carrying a guitar case nearly as long as she was tall. It was an old hard show case, the kind covered in pebbled black vinyl that had gone gray at the corners where the cardboard underneath had worn through. One latch was held shut with a loop of orange baler twine. She carried it the way some kids carry a pet, with both arms and her whole concentration. And when Desmond reached down to take it from her, she shook her head once and kept it. Inside that case was a guitar that Brett Hollins, if he had opened it, would have valued at $40 and a polite suggestion to try the pawn shop on Spadina. He would have been wrong by a margin so large, it would have required a recalibration of everything he believed about who walked through which doors. But he didn't open it, and he didn't know. And so he held the glass door for the two of them with a smile that was really a smirk wearing a uniform, and he told them they were welcome to look around in a voice that meant the opposite. What had brought them down from a small town north of Peterborough on a Saturday morning was a guitar on a stand in the center of the gallery, behind a low velvet rope, lit from above like a relic. It was a 1934 flat top that had belonged to a maritime fiddler turned songwriter who had played it across half the country during the worst years of the Depression. And Hartley and Crane had it on loan for 2 weeks before it went to a museum in Halifax. Quinn had read about it in a magazine her father kept in the shop, read about it the way she read about everything that touched the world she loved, slowly, out loud, asking questions between every line. She had decided weeks ago that she had to see it in person. And Desmond, who could refuse her almost nothing, and refused her this least of all, had filled the truck with gas and made the drive. He knew about the guitar already, of course. He knew more about it than the placard beside it said. But that was not a thing he mentioned to his daughter, or to anyone, because mentioning it would have meant explaining a great deal that he had spent 4 years quietly not explaining. The gallery floor was a long room of pale wood and softer light. There were instruments on stands and instruments behind glass, arch tops with tigered maple that seemed to move when you walked past, a wall of pre-war flat tops, a single cello in a corner with a sold tag on a string around its neck. Staff drifted between the displays in soft shoes. There was a freshness in the air, lemon oil and something floral from an arrangement on the front desk, and the particular hush of a place that had been polished early that morning because someone important was expected later. Quinn went straight for the 1934 guitar and stopped a careful meter back from the velvet rope, exactly where a child who has been raised to respect things stops without being told. She set her own case down at her feet, crouched, and began to read the placard half under her breath, comparing what it said to what she could see, naming the wood, the bracing pattern she couldn't see but knew was there, the year. Desmond stood behind her with his hands in his jacket pockets and let her have the moment. He was not looking at the famous guitar. He was watching his daughter look at it, which was, as far as he was concerned, the better of the two views. It was when Quinn reached out, not toward the famous guitar, but toward a banjo on a nearby stand. Just one fingertip, just to touch a thing she had only ever seen flat on a page, that Brett Hollins crossed the floor. He did it the way men like him do it, unhurried, performing the approach, reading the boots and the twine on the case and the oil he could practically smell on the man even though the man's hands were clean. He told the girl, loud enough that it carried, that the instruments were not for touching, that people who weren't buying should keep their hands to themselves. And he said it with an economy that suggested he'd had a great deal of practice doing the maximum amount of damage with the minimum number of words. Quinn pulled her hand back as if the banjo had gone hot. She looked up at her father with an expression he knew well and hated more each time he saw it. The look of a child who has just been shown a kind of unkindness she doesn't yet have the language to name. Desmond crouched down to her level. He kept his voice low and even, the voice he used in the shop when something had gone wrong, and panicking wouldn't fix it. He told her that looking was the whole point, that looking was its own thing entirely, that they had come to see, and they were seeing, and that was enough. Then he straightened up, took her hand, and walked her deeper into the gallery as though nothing at all had happened, and Brett Hollins watched them go and took out his phone and photographed the green truck through the window and sent it to the staff group with a caption, and got back the small laughter that such things are built to produce. There were things Brett Hollins did not know, because they were not written on Desmond Croft's boots, or his jeans, or the faint permanent dark in the creases of his knuckles that no soap had ever fully reached. He did not know that for the better part of a decade, before the green truck and the small shop and the town north of Peterborough, Desmond Croft had been the lead builder at Renard et Fresor, a workshop tucked into the hills of the Laurentians north of Montreal, a place that took the instruments no one else would touch, not because the work was beneath anyone, but because it was considered impossible, the kind of project a sane luthier turned down on sight. A guitar pulled from a house fire, a pre-war archtop that had spent a winter under a collapsed barn roof and come out the spring a kind of organic ruin, instruments that the experts had already written off, that the insurers had already paid out on, that everyone agreed were gone. Desmond Croft had spent 3 years on a single one of them, a flat top from the early 30s that had belonged to a Quebecois chansonnier and had been caught, along with most of the man's house, in the Saguenay flood of 1996. Water and silt and time had done to it what those things do. The community of people who cared about such instruments had agreed, in the gentle way they agree about hopeless things, that it was a loss to be mourned rather than a project to be undertaken. Desmond had taken it on anyway. He had worked from old photographs, from the few measurements that survived, from his own understanding of how that particular maker had braced a top and bent a side and cut a scarf joint in that particular decade. He had rebuilt it not to look like the original, but to be the original, down to the way it answered when you struck a low E and let it ring out in a quiet room. It had sold at auction in New York for a little over $2.5 million, more than any North American guitar had ever sold for, and the catalog had used the word resurrection, and a string of collectors who had never built anything in their lives had described it as a miracle. Desmond, when he thought of it at all, mostly remembered the smell of the silt, and the 11 months he had spent on the bracing alone, and the particular Tuesday he had finally gotten the top to do the thing he'd been chasing. He had not left that life because the work ran out. The work would never run out. He had left it because Adele was dying. She had been diagnosed late, the kind of late that closes the roads behind you one by one. They had come home, back across the country to the small Ontario town where her mother still lived, and Desmond had spent the last 19 months of Adele's life being as present as a person can be for another person, driving to appointments, learning the names of medications, reading to her in the long, flat evenings when speaking was more than she could manage, and listening was all she wanted. He had been good at it, as good as he was at everything he set his hands to, and it had not been enough, because it was the one thing in his life that no amount of skill or patience could be enough for. Quinn had been 3 when her mother died. After that, the question of whether to go back to the Laurentians, to the workshop, to the world that had called him a genius in 2 languages, simply answered itself. A 3-year-old needed a father at home more than the instrument world needed Desmond Croft. He rented a place on the edge of town with a detached garage out back, and he made the garage into a shop, and he hung up a hand-painted sign and started taking in the work a small town generates. School band rentals with cracked necks, a church's old upright that wouldn't hold tune, a teenager's first electric with a rattling input jack. Honest work. Small work. He let the people in Montreal write to him twice, and he answered neither letter, and after a while they stopped writing. He had made the smaller life on purpose, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. Because the alternative, to want the larger work again, to reach for it, and to do all of that alone in a house with a hole in the center of it, had seemed in those first years like a second death he wasn't sure he'd survive. The black SUV that turned into the Hartley and Crane lot at 11:15 made almost no sound at all. It parked the way certain vehicles park, with the unhurried precision of a driver accustomed to arriving in places where being seen to arrive is part of the transaction. The woman who stepped out of the back seat took the cold morning air in one measured breath and stood for a moment buttoning a charcoal wool coat over a cream blouse. Genevieve Rue was somewhere past 60, silver-haired, unhurried, dressed in the way that expensive things dress when they have long since stopped trying to be noticed. The only ornament she wore was a thin gold watch that had belonged to her grandfather, the man who had started the Rue Heritage Foundation 40 years earlier in a leased Montreal warehouse with 9 instruments, and the unfashionable conviction that the history of music lived in objects as much as in recordings, and that an irreplaceable instrument deserved the same care a country gives a painting it would never sell. Her grandfather had told her when she was small that the difference between a collector and a steward was whether you understood that the instrument had existed before you and would go on existing after you, and that your entire job was to carry it safely to whoever came next. She had been operating on that principle for 31 years, and she was very, very good at it. A younger woman came around from the other side of the vehicle with a tablet already open, reading the morning schedule aloud in a low voice. Priya, who had worked at Genevieve's side for 6 years and could read the older woman's silences like weather. Genevieve nodded once, which meant she had heard, and walked toward the entrance, where Stuart Beaumont, the gallery's manager, materialized roughly 4 seconds after the SUV became visible from the front desk, a feat of attentiveness that cost him considerable effort and was received as nothing more than the baseline of professional courtesy. She shook his hand, declined the offered coffee, and told him she had 15 minutes, and had come to look at the cello with the sold tag, which a client of hers was reconsidering. She came through the front doors and her presence did the thing it always did, which was hard to describe and easy to feel, not loudness. Genevieve Rue had never raised her voice in a professional setting in her life. It was more like density, a sense that the room had begun to be measured by instruments too fine to see. Her eyes went across the gallery floor in a single sweep, the displays, the lighting, the positions of the staff, the smudge on the glass that someone had missed. And then they found Quinn. The girl was crouched near the wall of pre-war flat tops, her own battered case at her feet, reading aloud in the low, deliberate voice children use when they are using the words as an anchor for something they are seeing directly. Genevieve stopped walking for one full second. What she felt was not exactly sentiment. It was closer to recognition. She had been that child. She had been the small girl who turned up in serious rooms because her grandfather had told her she belonged in every room where instruments lived, and she had brought a book as proof of her right to be there, and she had read the specifications aloud to whatever adult would hold still long enough to be read to. She started walking again, and then she saw the case. It was the angle of the light that did it. The orange twine, the worn corners, the whole sorry shape of it on the floor. None of that was what she saw. What she saw, in the low slant of late morning sun coming through the east windows, was the lid of the case standing open a few inches where Quinn had unlatched the good latch to peer inside, and the curve of the guitar's upper bout catching that light in a way that an ordinary guitar simply does not. Genevieve Rue had been looking at hand-built instruments for half a century. She knew, the way a tracker knows a fresh print from an old one, the difference between a top that has been carved and graduated by a human hand reading the wood as it goes, and a top that has been thicknessed by a machine to a number on a chart. The first one breathes a little. Even sitting still, the arch of it isn't quite mathematical. There's a kind of intelligence in the asymmetry that no program has ever managed to fake, because it isn't randomness. It's judgment. 1,000 small decisions made by someone who could feel the wood getting closer to right. She stopped beside Quinn and asked gently if she might look. Quinn looked up at her, took the measure of the silver hair and the quiet coat and the kind of stillness adults rarely have, and decided in the unaccountable way of children that this one was all right. She opened the case the rest of the way. The guitar inside looked, at a glance, like a hard-used old thing. The finish was worn through at the edge where a forearm rests. The sound hole rosette was simple, The whole instrument had the matte-handled look of something that lived in a child's arms rather than behind glass. It was, frankly, a little large for the girl who owned it. Genevieve did not touch it. She crouched, her good knee complaining, and she looked. She looked at the grain of the top and the way it had been worked. She looked at the join where the neck met the body. She tilted her head and looked along the side at the binding, at a purfling line so fine and so evenly laid that it read less like decoration than like a signature. She looked for a long time at things that, to Brett Hollins watching from across the room, would have looked like nothing at all. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular, in the voice she used when she was thinking out loud, that the top was hand-graduated. Every bit of it. And the bracing under it, she'd put money on it, was carved and tuned by ear and not by any chart in the world. Priya, who had been beside her for 6 years, recognized the pause for what it was, and stopped reading the schedule mid-sentence. Genevieve straightened. She asked Quinn with great seriousness, as though addressing a fellow professional, where the guitar had come from. Quinn told her that her dad made it. For her. For when she was big enough. There was a silence then, in that small circle of the gallery floor, that had a different quality than the silence of the room. Genevieve Rue looked at the worn guitar in its sad old case, and then she looked up and across the floor to where a lean man in a canvas jacket stood reading the placard beside a vintage archtop, not the price, the description, with the unhurried attention of a man who finds such things genuinely interesting. And she said to Priya that she needed to speak to him. She crossed the floor. Stuart Beaumont, sensing a shift in the room's weather and not understanding it, followed at a distance. Brett Hollins, who still had not assembled the pieces of what was happening, watched the most important visitor of the month walk straight past the cello she'd come to see and toward the man with the green truck. Desmond looked up at the sound of her step. She was not a person you glanced away from. She gave her name and asked if the guitar belonged to the little girl by the flat tops. He said it did. She asked who had built it. He said he had. There was a pause, not awkward, not empty, but the kind of pause that happens when a person is rapidly rebuilding their picture of the world to fit a new fact. Then Genevieve Rue said that she had been looking at hand-carved tops for 31 years, and at her grandfather's collection for 31 before that, and that she could count on the fingers of one hand the builders alive who could graduate a top to that consistency by hand, and tune the bracing by ear and leave a purfling line that clean. She said that one of those builders had died the previous winter. She said that another of them had worked, years ago, at a small atelier in the Laurentians called Renard et Frères. She said his name, Desmond Croft. It was not quite a question. Across the floor, near the front desk, there was a small sound. A glass set down with a fraction too much force. Stuart Beaumont turned and looked at Brett Hollins with an expression that needed no translation. Genevieve did not turn at all. She kept her eyes on Desmond. Quinn had come up beside her father by then, leaning into his hip in the way she did when a stranger held his attention too long. The old case clutched against her. She looked up at the silver-haired woman, and then back at her father, and Desmond rested a hand on the top of her head without thinking about it. He confirmed his name. Genevieve said she knew about the guitar from the Saguenay, the one everyone had said was gone. She said she had been in the room in New York when it sold. She said she also knew about the offer he had turned down 4 years ago. The collector who had wanted him to build a convincing copy of a famous lost instrument and pass time and craft off as history, and the $500,000 he had said no to. Desmond said, simply, that he didn't make fakes. Genevieve said she knew that too, and that it was, in fact, the precise reason she was standing in front of him instead of in front of any of the other names she'd been carrying around in a notebook for 2 years. She asked how long the guitar had taken him. He said a little over 4 years, off and on, whenever the shop was quiet. She asked if he'd worked alone. He said that Quinn had been with him for most of it, on a stool he'd cut down to her height when she was small and had never raised back up, handing him things, asking why, falling asleep against the workbench when the work ran late. He did not explain what the guitar meant, and Genevieve did not ask him to. She asked if he would sell it. He said no. She said she would pay whatever number he wanted to name. He said it didn't have a number. Quinn, who had been following more of this than the adults realized, said, with the flat finality of a 7-year-old delivering an obvious truth, that the lady couldn't buy the guitar because her dad made it for her, and it wasn't for selling, it was for keeping. The gallery went as quiet as a gallery can go when there is still air moving through the vents and someone in the back is still, faintly, polishing something. Genevieve Rue looked down at the girl for a moment. Then, for the first time in the conversation, the corner of her mouth moved. Brett Hollins's understanding of what had happened arrived in stages, the way bad news always does. The fact first, then the context, then the slow weight of the context pressing down on everything that had felt light an hour earlier. It arrived through his own phone, through the staff group he had used to send the photo of the truck, where one of the junior staff had found and posted a link, a feature from a trade magazine 6 years old, 4 pages with photographs, headlined, "The Ghost of the Laurentians, How One Builder Resurrected a Guitar." Everyone had buried. There was a photo of Desmond, younger, standing in a clean Quebec workshop with the restored flat top across his knees and the expression a person wears when they've finished something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Brett read it in pieces, standing in the middle of the gallery floor. He read the auction figure. He read a quote from a museum director that said only, "We had grieved it. We were wrong to." He read a line near the end where a professor described Croft's work as a standard of honesty the trade might not see again in a generation. Then he looked up, across the room at the man in the canvas jacket, who was now crouched down listening to his daughter explain something with great animation, and Brett felt a thing he didn't have a clean word for. Not quite shame. Something more structural than that, like a floor shifting slightly under a weight it hadn't been built to hold. The meeting Genevieve Rue had actually come to Toronto to take, the one Stuart Beaumont had been preparing for since 8 that morning, happened 20 minutes later at a small table in the corner, with water no one drank and a plate of biscuits no one touched. Priya sat at Genevieve's right, Desmond sat across. Quinn had been led off by a young staffer named Colton, the one person in the building who had treated the girl with uncomplicated friendliness from the moment she'd arrived. Crouching to her level, letting her ask her endless questions, and she was now standing in front of the famous 1934 flat top, finally seeing it from up close, narrating it quietly to herself. Genevieve spoke plainly the way she always did, as though she'd decided long ago that time spent on preamble was time stolen from the conversation itself. She told him about the Heritage Tour, an exhibition the Foundation was mounting, the most significant surviving instruments of the last century, traveling to 24 cities across the country and beyond over 3 years. 6 of those instruments still needed full restoration, from damaged or incomplete original condition, real ground-up work, plate carving, brace tuning, neck resets, the kind of work that could not be hurried and could not be faked. She had spent 2 years trying to find one person she trusted to lead it. She'd had 4 names. 2 had been hired away by museums. 1 had retired. The 4th, she said, had spent the morning being told by a salesman not to let his daughter touch the merchandise. She asked if he would take it. Master builder for the Heritage Project. A 3-year arrangement. His own workshop. His own conditions. His own team. Travel kept to a handful of trips a year, nothing longer than a couple of weeks, all of it scheduled around a child. His name on every label, every catalog, every wall card. His fee set by his number, not hers. Desmond was quiet for a while. He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the table. He said he had a 7-year-old. Genevieve said she knew. She said she'd built the whole thing around that fact before she'd ever known his name. He said the girl needed her father home. She said the conditions were written so that he would be. He said he'd have to think about it. She said, of course, and took a card from the inside of her coat, heavy stock, a single color, her name and a number and nothing else, and set it on the table between them. She said there was no deadline. Then she stood, and she added, almost as an afterthought, in the level voice she used for plain facts, that a man who spends 4 years building a guitar for his daughter that he has no intention of selling or showing, a man who does that simply because the thing deserved to exist, is a man who ought to be working, and not at the level he had let himself sink to. She looked once across the room at the worn case leaning against the wall, and then she walked out, and the black SUV left the lot without ceremony a few minutes after. The afternoon moved slow through the gallery the way afternoons do, once the main thing has already happened. Stuart Beaumont gave the scheduled clients their tour with the polished smoothness of a man who'd had an hour to compose himself and had used every minute of it. Brett Hollins worked, professionally, took a deposit on an archtop from a man who hadn't needed much convincing, filled out the paperwork carefully, was perfectly courteous. He did his job. He would keep doing his job, but something had been adjusted in him that morning in a way that did not have an off switch, and he was aware of it as a low, steady hum under the ordinary sounds of the room, a thing that returned each time he passed the front window and saw the green truck still sitting in the visitor bay. He crossed paths with Desmond once, near the front, where Desmond was waiting while Quinn said a long and serious goodbye to Colton. Brett stopped. He didn't make a speech. He said he'd been wrong, and that he was sorry, to him and to the girl. That was all. Desmond looked at him for a moment and said he knew. There was a pause between them that was neither warm nor cold, but simply honest. And then it was over, and Brett moved off, and Desmond let it be exactly the size it was. They drove home in the dark, north out of the city and onto the quieter roads, Quinn asleep against the door before they'd cleared the suburbs, the old case belted carefully into the middle of the bench between them because she wouldn't let it ride in the back. Desmond drove with one wrist on the wheel and the heater ticking and his daughter's slow breathing under the radio, and he thought about Adele, who had sat in a folding chair in the Laurentian shop on her good days just to watch him work, who had once put her hand flat on a bare spruce top he'd been thinning and moved her fingers across it and said nothing, and how that silence had been the finest review anything he'd ever made had received. She had told him, near the end, not to make himself small, not to disappear into a careful little life just because a careful little life couldn't hurt him the way the real one could. He had promised. He was not certain, in the years since, that he had kept the promise as fully as she'd meant it. That night, after Quinn was asleep with a picture book sliding off her chest, he sat out in the cold shop on the stool he'd cut down for her and never raised. And he looked at Genevieve Rue's card on the workbench between a coffee tin of files and a jar of polishing compound. He sat for a long time without deciding anything. Sunday came in gray and low, the sky the color of old pewter, the first real bite of the season in the air. He was already in the shop when Quinn padded out in her pajamas, hair going 4 directions, and climbed onto the stool beside him without asking, which left almost no room for the two of them, and neither of them moved to make more. She looked at the guitar she'd left out on its stand the night before, and then at her father, and asked what he was thinking about. He said he was thinking about whether he wanted to build the old guitars again, the important ones, the kind that ended up in museums. She considered this with her whole face. Then she told him that none of those guitars could be better than theirs. He laughed, not the polite laugh of a man going through the motions, but a real one, the kind that comes up out of the chest before you can stop it. He reached over and fixed the collar of her pajama top where it had folded under. Then he stood up, and he picked the card up off the bench and looked at it one more time in the thin morning light, and he put it in the front pocket of his shirt. He told her they were going to go get breakfast first, and that he'd tell her the whole thing on the way back. She jumped down off the stool and grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the door, and he let himself be pulled. The side door closed behind them, and the shop went quiet, and the guitar stood alone on its stand in the gray early light, which came soft through the high window and lay across the worn old finish in a way that would have shown anyone with the right kind of eyes, that under the handled wear and the modest rosette and the patient ears, every line of it had been put exactly where it was meant to go, by a man who understood that the difference between an ordinary thing and an extraordinary one is never the wood or the money or the time alone, but the intention you carry into it, and the willingness to do the work no one will ever see and ask no one to notice it was done. What stays with me about Desmond Croft isn't the auction figure or the magazine feature or the silver-haired woman who walked past a cello she'd flown in to see. It's the stool he cut down for Quinn when she was small and never raised back up. That stool tells me almost everything. A man who shapes a workspace around a child he is choosing, every single day, over the easier and louder life he could have had that. That's a man whose whole character was already settled long before Brett Hollins laughed at his truck. I keep coming back to the chain of it because nothing in that gallery happened by accident. Brett mocked the worn case because he had trained himself to read people by their boots, and that habit cost him the one customer in the room who actually mattered. Genevieve Rue recognized the guitar because 31 years of honest looking had given her eyes that couldn't be fooled, and the guitar was worth recognizing because Desmond had spent 4 years doing work no one would ever see, tuning bracing by ear in a cold shop while his daughter slept against the bench. The reveal felt like luck. It wasn't. It was the harvest of 100 quiet Tuesdays. There's a kind of decency in him I want to name plainly. When someone offered him $500,000 to build a convincing fake, he said no, because a thing built to deceive was a thing he refused to put his hands to. That refusal is the root the whole story grows from. Genevieve told him so herself. She came to him precisely because he wouldn't make fakes. The right thing, done when no one is checking, has a way of becoming the reason the right door opens later. But decency alone wouldn't have built that top. What moves me is how his skill and his honesty were the same muscle. The judgment in that hand-carved arch, the thousand small decisions only a trained mind could make, that's intelligence you can hold in your hands. He didn't inherit it, he earned it, panel by panel, fire-damaged guitar by flood-ruined guitar, paying attention until paying attention became who he was. And underneath both, there was the part I find hardest and most worth keeping. He kept going. He lost Adele, and he could have shrunk into a manageable little life that couldn't hurt him again. And for a while I think he did, the grit it took to stay, to raise Quinn alone, and then to pick that card up off the bench and put it in his pocket. That quiet refusal to disappear is the thing I'd want my own kids to carry. So I tell people what Quinn told the most powerful collector in the country without blinking. No fancy thing is better than the one your father made for you. Build like that. Stay honest, keep learning, and don't quit on the work that's actually yours.